You ever have that one teacher everyone feared, but not because he was strict, because he was unfair? Ours used to give lower grades to the poor kids. Didn't matter how much we studied, how perfect our answers were, he always found a reason to mark us down. Meanwhile, the kids from wealthier families? They could hand in half-finished work and still walk away with A's. For years, I thought that was just life. But the truth has a way of catching up, and you won't believe what finally happened to him. Back when I was in high school, grades weren't just numbers on a page. They were a currency. They determined scholarships, opportunities, college applications, and in a lot of ways, how the world judged your worth. For kids like me, coming from families that didn't have much, grades weren't just about pride. They were our ticket out. We didn't have connections or money to cushion us if things went wrong. We had to be better on paper, sharper, cleaner, more perfect. And believe me, we tried. But in our school, there was one man who seemed determined to make sure that never happened, Mr. Larkin. He was the history teacher, and from the outside, he looked like one of those respectable, old-fashioned educators. Always wore a tie, kept his hair slicked back, carried around a leather briefcase like he was walking into a courtroom instead of a classroom. Parents respected him because he looked the part. But for us, especially the kids who didn't come from money, he was a nightmare. It started subtle. A friend of mine, Daniel, turned in an essay that he had worked on for weeks. I'd read it myself, and it was solid, better than mine, honestly. He got a C. Meanwhile, a kid named Trevor, whose dad was a local business owner and donated to the PDA every year, turned in something that looked like it was written in 20 minutes, and he got an A. When Daniel asked why, Mr. Larkin smirked and said, "Presentation matters." That was the first time I noticed the pattern, but it wasn't the last. By the time I was a sophomore, it was crystal clear. If you were from a wealthy family, you were in his good books. If you weren't, he'd cut you down any chance he got. Lower grades, harsher criticism, even public humiliation when you try to speak up in class. He had this way of making you feel small, like your background defined you. Like you weren't worth the same respect as the kids who came to school wearing expensive sneakers and bragging about their vacations. I'll never forget one day he said, right in front of the class, "Some of you should stop dreaming about college. Trade schools are more realistic." His eyes landed directly on me when he said it. The class laughed nervously, but I sat there, staring at my desk, feeling the blood rush to my face. It wasn't advice, it was an insult. What made it worse was the silence. The other teachers either didn't see it or didn't care. The administration ignored complaints. And the wealthier parents? They loved him because their kids thrived under his grading system. It was as if the entire school had agreed to look the other way, while kids like me were quietly suffocated. I didn't know it at the time, but that injustice was planting a seed. I kept telling myself, one day, someone has to notice. One day, it's going to come back around. I just had no idea how explosive that one day would be. It was junior year when the cracks in Mr. Larkin's perfect image finally started to show. Up until then, he'd managed to keep his favoritism looking like high standards. If anyone questioned him, he'd throw around words like meritocracy or rigor, and the adults bought it. But one day, he slipped, and he slipped in a way that no one could ignore. We had just finished midterm exams, the kind that counted for a huge portion of our grade. I remember walking into class that morning with a knot in my stomach. I had studied harder than I ever had before. Flashcards, late nights, study groups. I needed at least a B to stay competitive for the scholarship I was aiming for. When Mr. Larkin handed me my paper, the red ink nearly blinded me. D+. I felt my throat tighten. My answers weren't perfect, sure, but they weren't D+ material. I glanced over at Daniel, who looked just as crushed. He got a C. Then I glanced at Trevor. He was grinning, waving his exam around like a trophy. A big fat A in bold red at the top. But here's the kicker. When he turned a page, I saw half his essay section was blank. Completely blank. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't just unfair anymore. It was blatant. Too blatant to ignore. That day, after class, a few of us stayed behind to compare papers. Daniel pulled out his exam, and we started lining it up against Trevor's. Daniel's answers were longer, more detailed, cited actual historical events. Trevor had 2 paragraphs that looked like they were copied out of the textbook. And yet Trevor had a glowing, excellent work scribbled in the margins, while Daniel's was covered in comments like lacks depth and weak argument. We knew what was happening. But this time we had proof. Real, physical proof. The kind that didn't just sting, it enraged us. Word spread fast. By lunch, half the cafeteria was buzzing about how Trevor's paper had been basically empty, but graded like gold. Some kids laughed it off, saying that's just how the world works. Others, like me, couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just grades. This was a man actively deciding who deserved a future and who didn't, based on nothing but their parents' wallets. I went home that day boiling. My mom noticed immediately. She asked what was wrong, and when I told her, she looked tired, like she'd heard this story before. "Don't pick a fight you can't win," she said quietly. But the thing was, it didn't feel like a fight anymore. It felt like survival. The next morning, things escalated. Trevor, cocky as ever, actually bragged in homeroom. "Larkin basically gives me A's no matter what. Guess I'm just his favorite." He said it loud enough for half the class to hear. Some kids laughed, others looked down. I clenched my fists under the desk. And that's when I realized Mr. Larkin's downfall wasn't going to come from us complaining quietly. It was going to come from him, from his own arrogance, from the way he'd gotten so comfortable playing God with our futures that he thought he was untouchable. I didn't know how or when, but I knew the balance had shifted. The mask had slipped. And once people see the cracks, they can't unsee them. But that was just the beginning. After the midterm fiasco, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Everywhere I went, I kept hearing Trevor's voice bragging about how he didn't even need to try. It wasn't just annoying, it was eating me alive. I had given everything, and yet my future felt like it was being decided behind closed doors by a man who thought kids like me weren't worth the ink on his grading pen. A week later, I stumbled on something that pushed suspicion into certainty. It started when Daniel asked me to help him organize notes for the debate club. He had access to the teacher's lounge copier that afternoon because one of the faculty sponsors trusted him. While we were stacking papers, a folder slipped out from a pile Mr. Larkin had left behind. It was labeled Midterms, Grading Rubric. Daniel picked it up and laughed bitterly. "You think he actually uses this?" I don't know what made me look inside, but I did. The rubric was clear, with point systems and examples. And if you compared that to our actual graded exams, it didn't match at all. Trevor's blank sections alone should have been an automatic fail. Meanwhile, Daniel's detailed answers ticked every single requirement. The rubric practically screamed that he deserved an A. Instead, he had a C. I felt my stomach churn. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was fraud. Daniel looked pale. "If this got out," he started, but then his voice trailed off. Because we both knew, if we accused him without backing, it'd be our word against his. And in this school, his word always won. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the unfairness over and over. My mom's warning echoed in my head. "Don't pick a fight you can't win." But what if I could win? What if this wasn't just about me? What if this was about all the kids he'd crushed year after year, the ones who stopped believing they were smart enough because he made sure their grades said otherwise? The next morning, I made a decision. I borrowed an old digital recorder my uncle had lying around. I told myself it was just in case. Just in case I caught him saying something out loud that could prove what he was doing. It felt sneaky, even wrong. But so did what he had been doing to us for years. For days, nothing happened. I carried that recorder in my backpack like a secret weapon, waiting. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, it happened. Trevor stayed after class, joking about how he hadn't studied at all. Mr. Larkin actually chuckled and said, "Don't worry, you'll get an A. Some kids need a leg up. Others? Well, they'll learn life isn't fair." My heart was pounding as I checked the recorder later. Clear as day, his voice was there. The smirk I had imagined was practically dripping from every word. I stared at the device in my hands, my palms sweating. I had proof now. Real proof. But proof is dangerous. Proof makes you a target. I told Daniel about it the next day, and his face lit up for a second before twisting into worry. "If he finds out you recorded him," he said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. For the first time, I realized what I was holding could either destroy him or destroy me. Then I found something that confirmed my worst fears. The recording was enough to keep me awake at night. I played it over and over again, headphones shoved deep into my ears so my mom wouldn't hear. Every time, his smug voice made my stomach twist. Some kids need a leg up. Others? Well, they'll learn life isn't fair. It wasn't just casual cruelty. It was his entire philosophy, spoken out loud, captured forever. But part of me still thought, maybe people won't believe it. Maybe they'll say I edited the audio or took it out of context. I needed something stronger, something that no one could deny. That's when luck, or maybe fate, handed me exactly what I needed. A month later, Daniel and I were working late on a project in the computer lab. Most of the teachers had gone home, but Mr. Larkin's office light was still on. When he left briefly, I noticed he'd forgotten to log off his computer. Daniel and I exchanged a look. We shouldn't. We knew we shouldn't. But curiosity burned hotter than fear. We clicked open his gradebook file. What we saw made my jaw drop. It wasn't just favoritism. It was systematic. Next to every student's name, he had little notes, not about academics, but about family background. Beside kids like Trevor, father equals major donor. Mom equals alum. Next to kids like me and Daniel, financial aid, low-income housing. One line actually read, not college material. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My hands were shaking as I scrolled further. It was all there in black and white. He wasn't grading based on performance at all. He was grading based on class, based on money, based on who our parents were. Daniel whispered, "He's been deciding our futures before we even turned in the assignments." His voice cracked, and I realized he wasn't just angry. He was broken. I copied the file onto a flash drive with trembling fingers, every second terrified he'd walk back in. When I pulled the drive out, my heart was pounding so loud I was sure Daniel could hear it. We shut the computer down and practically ran out of the building. That night, I sat on my bed staring at the flash drive. I felt sick. I wanted to vomit. Years of doubt, humiliation, late nights wondering if I was just stupid, and here was the truth. It was never about us. It was always about him and his twisted system. My chest was tight, like I couldn't breathe. I started pacing, gripping my hair with both hands. Every insult, every lowered grade, every time he'd smirked while telling me I shouldn't aim too high, came flooding back. And now I knew it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just me being paranoid. It was deliberate, calculated. I don't remember when I started crying. It wasn't the quiet kind of crying either. It was messy, angry, ugly. My mom knocked on my door, but I told her I had a headache. How could I explain? How could I tell her that the man she trusted to educate me had been sabotaging my life, year after year, just because she worked double shifts and we couldn't afford vacations like Trevor's family? I barely slept that night. When I closed my eyes, I saw his smug grin. When I opened them, I saw the flash drive sitting on my desk like it was burning a hole through my room. By morning, I knew two things. One, I couldn't keep this to myself. And two, once this came out, nothing would ever be the same. But I wasn't ready for what I was about to discover next. Because as damning as the files were, they were just the tip of something much bigger, something that went beyond grades, beyond one teacher, and into the very system we thought we could trust. And I wasn't ready for what I was about to discover. I thought the grade book was the end game, the final nail in his coffin. But as it turned out, it was only the beginning. Because once you start pulling at a loose thread, you realize the whole sweater is unraveling. A few days after I copied the files, I met Daniel in the library. We plugged in the flash drive and scrolled further than we had the night in his office. That's when we noticed a separate folder, parent correspondence. My gut told me not to open it, but of course, we did. Inside were dozens of emails. Not just casual notes, but conversations between Mr. Larkin and certain parents. Some of them practically spelled out deals. Appreciate the generous PD donation this year. Rest assured Trevor's grades will reflect his effort. Another one said, "We'll be increasing our pledge to the new science wing. Hope my daughter's transcript shows her potential." And his replies? Polished, diplomatic, but clear enough. Quid pro quo. I remember leaning back in my chair, staring at the screen like it was written in another language. It wasn't favoritism anymore. It was business. He wasn't just a biased teacher. He was running a whole side hustle of academic corruption. Daniel muttered, "This could ruin him." Then, after a pause, "This could ruin the school." And that's when the weight of it hit me. This wasn't just about Mr. Larkin being cruel to poor kids. It was about how deep the rot went. If parents were buying grades, if donations were literally purchasing futures, then what chance did kids like us ever have? The anger I felt was different this time. Before, it was personal. Now, it was bigger. It was about justice. About how many kids before us had been crushed under this system, their college dreams destroyed not because they weren't good enough, but because they weren't wealthy enough. But with that anger came fear. If we exposed this, would anyone believe us? Or would they bury it, protect him, protect the donors, and paint us as troublemakers? That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. I thought about my mom working overtime shifts so I could stay in this school. I thought about Daniel's parents, who were so proud every time he talked about being the first in his family to go to college. And I thought about all the kids whose names were probably buried in those grade books before ours. Kids who never even knew why doors kept slamming in their faces. By morning, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about exposing the truth, no matter how ugly it was. The only question was, how? We couldn't just run to the principal. He'd been turning a blind eye for years. And going to the school board felt like walking into a lion's den. But one way or another, we had to make sure the world saw what we'd seen. And as determined as I felt, I had no idea just how much worse things were going to get once the fight really began. This went so much deeper than I thought. Those next few weeks were some of the longest of my life. Every day, I walked into class with the flash drive in my backpack. Like a live grenade I was pretending didn't exist. On the outside, nothing changed. Mr. Larkin still smirked when he handed out papers. Trevor still bragged about how easy it all was, and the rest of us still swallowed the humiliation. But inside, I was tearing apart. At night, I couldn't shut my brain off. I kept imagining what would happen if I went public. Best case scenario, he got fired, and people finally admitted we were right all along. Worst case scenario, the administration buried it, and I became the problem kid. Colleges don't hand scholarships to kids labeled as troublemakers. And if Larkin found out I was behind it, he'd make sure my future was destroyed before I ever left high school. I tried to convince myself to let it go. I told myself, maybe you'll get a decent grade next time. Maybe it's not worth the risk. But then I'd remember the files, the emails, the way Daniel's voice cracked when he realized we'd never stood a chance. Letting it go felt like betraying every kid who had been written off as not college material before they even picked up a pencil. One night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I had to choose. Stay silent and play it safe, or risk everything to pull the mask off once and for all. My stomach was in knots, my chest heavy. But when I thought about my mom working double shifts so I could be in this school, I knew the answer. I couldn't let this slide. I spent sleepless nights planning, running through scenarios in my head, imagining who I could trust, how I could release the evidence, what would happen when it all blew up. Finally, after weeks of pacing and second-guessing, I knew what I had to do. When the breaking point came, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fight or a confrontation in class. It was quieter, almost calculated, like pulling the first pin from a grenade. I decided the safest first move was to go anonymous. No speeches, no finger-pointing. Just truth dropped into the right hands. Daniel agreed, though I could see the fear in his eyes every time we talked about it. We printed out copies of the gradebook notes and a few of the emails we'd found. We left out anything that could trace back to how we got them. Then, late one evening, I slipped the envelope into the mailbox addressed to the school board. No return address. No name. Just the evidence. For a week, nothing happened. Classes went on as usual. Mr. Larkin strutted around like the king of the castle. I started doubting myself. Maybe they ignored it. Maybe they buried it, just like we feared. Then the whispers began. Teachers huddled in corners. The principal walked into our classroom mid-lesson, pulled Mr. Larkin into the hallway, and didn't come back for 10 minutes. When he returned, his face was stiff, his smile brittle. That night, word spread that the board had called for a review of grading practices. It was vague, but we knew. They'd seen it. For the first time in years, I felt hope. The next few days were electric. Some kids laughed about it, saying maybe now Trevor would actually have to study. Others whispered that the whole thing was overblown. But every time I walked into class, I watched Mr. Larkin's face. He still wore that smug grin, but now his eyes darted around like he was checking for cracks in the walls. Daniel leaned over one day and whispered, "We did it. He's done." And for a moment, I believed him. But then, just as quickly, the ground shifted again. Mr. Larkin started dropping hints in class. Little comments like, "Some students think they're smarter than they are," or "Funny how certain kids always seem to have too much time on their hands." His eyes would linger on me, on Daniel. It was subtle, but it was a warning. One afternoon, he called me up to his desk after class. My stomach dropped as I walked forward. He didn't say much, just tapped my paper with his pen and said, "Careful who you cross. Colleges don't like troublemakers." He smiled when he said it, but his eyes were sharp, cold. I walked out of the room with my hands shaking. The message was clear. He knew. Or at least, he suspected. And if he went down, he was willing to take us with him. For a brief moment, it felt like the battle was over. The board was involved, the whispers were spreading, and justice seemed possible. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Because what came next wasn't resolution, it was escalation. I thought it was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. For a brief stretch of time, it almost felt like we'd won. The investigation was underway. Teachers were whispering more openly, and some students started treating Mr. Larkin with a mix of curiosity and caution instead of fear. His lectures lost their bite. His smirk looked thinner. It was like watching a king suddenly stripped of his crown, forced to pretend nothing had changed while everyone around him knew the truth. I let myself relax. Just a little. My grades even started creeping upward, like he was trying to overcompensate in case anyone checked his recent work. Daniel joked that we should frame our next tests, proof that justice had finally arrived. For the first time in months, I went home and slept through the night without waking up in a sweat. There was even a day when I walked past his classroom and saw him sitting alone at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He didn't look powerful. He didn't look untouchable. He looked cornered. And a part of me thought, maybe that's enough. Maybe just knowing he couldn't keep doing this was victory in itself. But it didn't last. It couldn't. Because the thing about people like Mr. Larkin is they don't go quietly. They don't admit defeat and fade into the background. They lash out. They find ways to claw back whatever power they think they've lost. And sure enough, within weeks, the tension started creeping back into the hallways. A rumor here, a strange look there. Something was brewing, and I could feel it in my bones. The calm didn't last long. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a meeting slip. I was sitting in homeroom when my name was called over the intercom. Report to the principal's office. My stomach dropped. Daniel shot me a look that said everything. They know? When I walked in, the principal was sitting behind his desk, flanked by Mr. Larkin. The sight of them together was enough to make my pulse spike. The principal cleared his throat and slid a piece of paper toward me. We've had some troubling information, he said. It seems someone's been spreading false documents. False. The word hit me like a punch. My eyes darted to the paper. It was a copy of the gradebook notes, the same ones I'd printed. Except now, they were highlighted and circled in ways that made them look like I had forged them. At the bottom, someone had scrawled, likely student fabrication. I stammered something about it not being fake, that there was more, but the principal raised a hand. Be careful, son. Accusing staff without evidence can have serious consequences. And just like that, the tables turned. When I left the office, Mr. Larkin leaned close enough for only me to hear. I warned you, he whispered. His breath smelled like stale coffee, and his voice dripped with satisfaction. That week was a nightmare. Suddenly, my locker was being randomly searched. Teachers who'd always been neutral started treating me differently, like I was some kind of troublemaker. Notes showed up in my desk. Snitch. Fake. Daniel even got pulled aside and questioned, and when he came back, he wouldn't meet my eyes. For the first time, I felt the tide turning against me. It wasn't just Larkin anymore. It was the whole machine. The administration, the wealthy parents, even some students who benefited from the system. They all had something to lose if the truth came out, and they weren't about to let a couple of kids blow it all up. The worst blow came when I overheard two of my teachers talking in the hallway. One of them said, "The board doesn't want this to get messy. They'll probably just dismiss it quietly." Dismiss it quietly. Like all of this, the years of sabotage, the stolen futures, the blatant corruption, was nothing but a minor inconvenience to sweep under the rug. I went home that night shaking with rage. My mom asked what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Not yet. Not when everything felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Daniel finally admitted he was scared. "What if they expel us?" he whispered. "What if this ruins everything?" His fear was contagious, and for a moment, I felt myself breaking. Maybe we had gone too far. Maybe we should have just kept our heads down like everyone else. But then I remembered the flash drive. The emails. The recording. They hadn't seen it all. Not yet. And if the board wanted to bury this, fine. I'd take it somewhere they couldn't bury it. That night, I drafted an anonymous email. I attached the files, the audio clip, the screenshots. And I sent them not just to the school board, but to the local newspaper. My hands were trembling when I clicked send. My future felt like it was hanging by a thread. But deep down, I knew this was the only way. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within days, reporters were sniffing around. Parents were demanding answers. The school tried to spin it, saying it was a misunderstanding. But once the emails hit the front page, there was no spinning left to do. For the first time, it felt like we had the upper hand. But the chaos was just beginning, and I wasn't ready for how dark things would get before it was over. What happened next made me question everything I thought I knew. The days after the article dropped were a hurricane. At first I felt vindicated, strangers calling my phone, reporters asking questions, parents shaken awake by the idea their donations had bought more than a new lab bench. But very quickly, the praise turned into pressure. People wanted answers now, and I had never imagined how hollow the victory would feel when the stakes became my life. Suddenly, I was the face of a scandal I hadn't asked for. Local anchors replayed the clip of Mr. Larkin's voice like it was a movie trailer. Parents who had never spoken to me before came to the school demanding hearings. My inbox filled with messages, some thanking me, some threatening me, some telling me to shut up and ruin my future. Colleges called my school for comment. The whole thing escalated faster than I could keep up with. Then the untenable stuff started. The district opened an emergency review, and, at administration request, I was placed under interim discipline pending the investigation. They said it was standard procedure. Students involved in allegations sometimes needed to be restricted from extracurriculars. In practice, it looked a lot like exile. My scholarship interview was postponed. My debate club position put on hold. Suddenly the doors I'd been trying to keep open felt as if they were closing, and not because of Mr. Larkin, but because the system was protecting itself by punishing the squeaky wheel. Word spread through the halls in a new, cruel way. Some kids who had applauded the story a week ago now whispered, "Attention seeker," and "liar," as if they'd rehearsed the lines. Trevor's parents put pressure on the school to restore confidence, and that pressure found targets, me and Daniel. Daniel stopped coming to school some days. When he did, he looked stripped of color. He told me his dad had been called in and warned. If this blew up more, it could hurt Daniel's chances too. "They're scared," he said. "They'll do whatever it takes." The worst night was when an envelope showed up at our mailbox. No stamp, no return, just a single sheet inside with handwriting I recognized from the emails. A terse, "Some truths are dangerous. Stop now or you'll lose everything." I slept with the light on and woke up every hour, listening for car doors, footsteps. My mom noticed I'd stopped eating properly and forced down dinners with a worried look she tried to hide from me. The thing about being at the bottom is how many ways there are to fall further. A teacher I had trusted, the science teacher who used to criticize Mr. Larkin quietly in the staff room, told me she'd been called into a meeting and told not to comment. "They're arranging legal counsel," she whispered. "They're circling the wagons." It felt like a siege, and I was the only one with a handful of matches. On the morning the board announced it would not immediately suspend Mr. Larkin pending a full external audit, my stomach dropped farther than I thought possible. They said due process required time, that accusations weren't convictions. They used neutral language that sounded civilized and felt poisonous. People clung to the phrasing as if it absolved them. I stood in the hallway as Mr. Larkin passed by, and for the first time I saw indifference on his face instead of smugness, the cold, calculated look of a man who knew how to survive. He didn't gloat. He didn't even need to. The system had shifted to protect itself, and I was learning the hardest lesson of all. Justice is not inevitable. Sometimes you have to keep fighting when everyone else is already tired of the noise. That's when I realized what I had to do to end this once and for all. The board's announcement should have broken me for good. Instead, it lit something I didn't know I had left. Fear had kept me awake. Humiliation had hollowed me out. But anger, real, cold anger, gave me focus. If the system wanted to stall, then I'd stop playing inside their lines. The local newspaper had already cracked the door open. Now, I was going to blow it off its hinges. I spent an entire weekend combing through every document on that flash drive. I highlighted contradictions, flagged emails, and put together a timeline that showed years of favoritism and donations connected to grades. Daniel helped, even though he was terrified. We both knew that once we released this, there was no going back. We weren't just exposing Mr. Larkin anymore. We were taking on the entire district. Monday morning, I walked into the principal's office uninvited, dropped the packet of evidence on his desk, and said, If you don't act, this goes national. His face turned gray. He sputtered about protocol and confidentiality, but I didn't wait for him to finish. I turned and walked out, my hands trembling, but my voice steady for the first time in months. That same afternoon, I emailed the full file to 3 national outlets. Within 48 hours, it was everywhere. Headline after headline. Local teacher accused of selling grades. School district under fire for corruption. Reporters camped outside the school. Parents stormed the board meeting demanding resignations. What had been whispers turned into a roar. And then came the hearing. The gymnasium was packed. Parents, teachers, students, even cameras. Mr. Larkin sat at the front, jaw tight, in his usual suit and tie, but the slicked-back confidence was gone. The superintendent tried to control the narrative, calling it a misunderstanding, but the emails I'd leaked were plastered on posters by protesters outside. There was no hiding. When it was my turn to speak, my throat went dry, but I forced myself to look straight at the board. We worked harder because we had to, I said, and he made sure it didn't matter. He told us, without ever saying the words, that our families made us less, that our futures could be bought. And you let him. The room went silent except for the clicking of cameras. Mr. Larkin tried to respond, tried to spin it as taken out of context, but then the audio played. His own voice, clear as a bell. Some kids need a leg up. Others? Well, they'll learn life isn't fair. The gasp from the crowd was deafening. That was the moment he broke. His shoulders sagged, his hands shook, and for the first time, he looked small. He didn't smirk. He didn't glare. He just stared at the table in front of him, like maybe if he didn't look up, the world would stop collapsing. The board had no choice. He was suspended immediately, pending termination. Within a week, the superintendent announced his resignation too. Donations that had once flowed like water dried up overnight. Parents who had bought their kids' futures were suddenly scrambling to explain why their students were struggling to pass. It wasn't clean. It wasn't neat. The district dragged its feet. Lawyers circled, and my name became both praised and cursed. But the truth was out, and no one could stuff it back into the shadows. The last time I saw Mr. Larkin, he wasn't in a suit. He was standing outside the school, cardboard box in his arms, eyes fixed on the ground as he walked to his car. Students watched from the windows, and for once, none of us looked away. And me? I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I just felt finished, exhausted, relieved, and older than I was. For years he had told us life wasn't fair. Maybe he was right. But that day, at least, fairness caught up to him.